When the blockade closed around West Berlin, the crisis moved from the roads of Germany to the desks of Washington. President Harry Truman faced a question that had no safe answer. How do you defend a city without starting another world war? On paper, West Berlin was protected by Allied rights. In reality, it was surrounded by Soviet power, and every road into the city now ran through territory controlled by the very government applying the pressure. The first option was withdrawal. The United States, Britain, and France could admit that the city was too exposed, pull back from Berlin, and avoid a direct confrontation with Moscow. But leaving Berlin would not look like caution. It would look like surrender. And in the first years of the Cold War, that kind of retreat could change the balance of Europe. Imagine the message it would send. A Western city abandoned under pressure, American flags lowered, checkpoints emptied, and Soviet influence expanding without a shot being fired. The second option was force. Allied commanders could try to send armed convoys down the roads into Berlin and challenge the blockade directly. That sounded simple until someone imagined the first Soviet checkpoint refusing to move. A truck column, a blocked road, nervous soldiers, loaded weapons, and orders coming from capitals that could not afford to blink. Only 3 years had passed since the end of the Second World War. Europe was still full of ruins, displaced families, damaged bridges, and men who remembered what escalation looked like. A convoy could become a firefight. A firefight could become a battle. A battle near Berlin could become a war between nuclear-age powers before the world had even learned the rules of the Cold War. So the third option remained: air supply. Not a symbolic flight, not a few emergency deliveries. A serious attempt to keep an entire city alive from the sky. At first, the numbers did not feel realistic. Berlin needed food, coal, medicine, fuel, and basic supplies every day, and the aircraft available in the beginning were not built to replace railroads. A cargo aircraft could land with sacks of flour and boxes of milk, but the city needed mountains of material. Coal alone was heavy, dirty, bulky, and essential for heat, power, and survival. Still, the sky offered something the roads did not. If the Western Allies flew through the established air corridors, they could challenge the blockade without driving a military column straight into a Soviet barrier. It was a narrow path between humiliation and war. The airlift would not break the blockade with tanks. It would test whether discipline, aircraft, pilots, and logistics could hold a city in place. General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor in Germany, understood that Berlin was more than a military position. It was a political signal, a test of Western resolve, and a promise made to the people who lived under Western protection. In Berlin, that promise had a human face. It was a family watching the stove burn lower, a shopkeeper counting empty shelves, a child hearing adults whisper about whether the Americans would stay.
If they leave, what happens to us? We have nowhere else to go.
That fear was exactly what the blockade was designed to create. The Soviet pressure was not only against governments. It was against the confidence of ordinary people who had already survived too much. Truman's decision was not to abandon Berlin. The United States would stay, and the answer would begin with aircraft lifting off from Western Germany toward a city that had been cut away from the ground. On June 26, 1948, the American airlift began under the name Operation Vittles. 2 days later, Britain followed with its own operation, and the emergency route into Berlin started to take shape. But Washington also understood how dangerous the crisis was. Even while the Allies searched for a peaceful solution, the United States sent B-29 bombers to Britain, aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons. That was the atmosphere around the airlift. Humanitarian cargo flew toward Berlin, while the shadow of a larger war hung over every decision.
We were not thinking about history then. We were thinking about weather, fuel, cargo, radio calls, and whether the runway would be clear when we arrived.
Before Stalin closed the roads to West Berlin, the city was already a time bomb. Every borderline, every checkpoint, every currency stamp, and every ruined street carried the pressure of a war that had ended on paper, but not in reality. Berlin was not just another German city. It was the former capital of Hitler's Reich, captured at enormous cost, then divided by the victorious powers into Soviet, American, British, and French sectors. On a map, the arrangement looked fragile from the beginning. The western sectors of Berlin sat more than 100 miles inside the Soviet occupation zone, like a small island surrounded by a hostile sea. To reach West Berlin from the western zones of Germany, the Allies depended on roads, railways, canals, and air corridors. Those routes were not just transportation lines. They were the lifelines of political survival. The city itself was exhausted. Blocks of apartments stood with shattered windows. Families lived among cracked walls, and people crossed streets where rubble still filled the edges like frozen waves. Food was scarce, fuel was precious, and ordinary life had become a daily calculation. A stove, a loaf of bread, a working tram line, or a few hours of electricity could feel like a victory. At first, the Allies had shared the ruins because they had shared the victory. But the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers was breaking apart, and Berlin became the place where that break could be seen in concrete and stone. The Soviets wanted influence over Germany's future. The Western Allies wanted to rebuild their zones into something stable enough to resist chaos, hunger, and communist pressure. That conflict was not only about soldiers. It was about money, food, factories, elections, newspapers, police authority, and the question of whether post-war Germany would recover as a free economy or remain under Soviet pressure. By 1948, the Western powers were moving closer together. Their occupation zones in Germany were being coordinated more tightly. And in Berlin, their sectors were becoming a single Western position inside a city claimed by competing futures. To Moscow, that looked like a threat. A stronger West Berlin could become a symbol, a listening post, and a political advertisement deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. Imagine standing at a checkpoint in that city. On one side were Western soldiers, American jeeps, British signs, and French uniforms. On the other side were Soviet guards, red stars, and the machinery of a different system. The line between them was not a battlefield, but it was not peace either. It was a warning line, and everyone knew that one wrong decision could turn a political crisis into something much more dangerous. Then came the issue that pushed everything closer to explosion: currency. The old German money had become unstable, and the Western powers believed that economic recovery needed a new, reliable currency. In June 1948, the Western powers introduced currency reform in their zones of Germany. For the Soviets, this was more than a financial decision. It was a signal that the Western zones were slipping out of Moscow's reach. When the new currency question reached Berlin, the dispute became sharper. Money was no longer just paper in people's hands. It became a weapon in the struggle over who would shape the future of the city.
Yesterday they wanted one kind of money. Today they want another. But my children still need bread.
For ordinary Berliners, the crisis arrived in practical details. Prices, ration cards, queues, rumors, and official notices mattered more than speeches from distant capitals. For Stalin, pressure on Berlin offered a chance to test the West. If he could make the city impossible to hold, the Americans, British, and French might leave without a war. That was the brutal elegance of the plan. The Soviet Union did not need to storm West Berlin. It only needed to make survival there feel impossible. The pressure came in stages. Inspections, delays, restrictions, and disputes over access became part of the atmosphere. Every truck, train, and canal barge reminded the Allies how exposed the city really was. Then, in late June 1948, the spark finally reached the powder. Ground access to West Berlin was cut off, and the fragile arrangement that had held since the end of the war began to collapse. Now the map mattered in the most direct way possible. A mother in a cold apartment, a pilot at an airfield, a general in a command room, and a president in Washington were all connected by the same question. Could the West hold Berlin without starting another war? Or would a city surrounded by Soviet power become the first major defeat of the Cold War? The next decision belonged to Harry Truman and his commanders. They had to choose between retreat, confrontation, and an idea so risky that even some of its supporters doubted it could work. Feeding Berlin from the sky. When the blockade closed around West Berlin, the crisis moved from the roads of Germany to the desks of Washington. President Harry Truman faced a question that had no safe answer. How do you defend a city without starting another world war? On paper, West Berlin was protected by Allied rights. In reality, it was surrounded by Soviet power, and every road into the city now ran through territory controlled by the very government applying the pressure. The first option was withdrawal. The United States, Britain, and France could admit that the city was too exposed, pull back from Berlin, and avoid a direct confrontation with Moscow. But leaving Berlin would not look like caution. It would look like surrender. And in the first years of the Cold War, that kind of retreat could change the balance of Europe. Imagine the message it would send. A Western city abandoned under pressure, American flags lowered, checkpoints emptied, and Soviet influence expanding without a shot being fired. The second option was force. Allied commanders could try to send armed convoys down the roads into Berlin and challenge the blockade directly. That sounded simple until someone imagined the first Soviet checkpoint refusing to move. A truck column, a blocked road, nervous soldiers, loaded weapons, and orders coming from capitals that could not afford to blink. Only 3 years had passed since the end of the Second World War. Europe was still full of ruins, displaced families, damaged bridges, and men who remembered what escalation looked like. A convoy could become a firefight. A firefight could become a battle. A battle near Berlin could become a war between nuclear-age powers before the world had even learned the rules of the Cold War. So the third option remained: air supply. Not a symbolic flight, not a few emergency deliveries. A serious attempt to keep an entire city alive from the sky. At first, the numbers did not feel realistic. Berlin needed food, coal, medicine, fuel, and basic supplies every day, and the aircraft available in the beginning were not built to replace railroads. A cargo aircraft could land with sacks of flour and boxes of milk, but the city needed mountains of material. Coal alone was heavy, dirty, bulky, and essential for heat, power, and survival. Still, the sky offered something the roads did not. If the Western Allies flew through the established air corridors, they could challenge the blockade without driving a military column straight into a Soviet barrier. It was a narrow path between humiliation and war. The airlift would not break the blockade with tanks. It would test whether discipline, aircraft, pilots, and logistics could hold a city in place. General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor in Germany, understood that Berlin was more than a military position. It was a political signal, a test of Western resolve, and a promise made to the people who lived under Western protection. In Berlin, that promise had a human face. It was a family watching the stove burn lower, a shopkeeper counting empty shelves, a child hearing adults whisper about whether the Americans would stay.
If they leave, what happens to us? We have nowhere else to go.
That fear was exactly what the blockade was designed to create. The Soviet pressure was not only against governments. It was against the confidence of ordinary people who had already survived too much. Truman's decision was not to abandon Berlin. The United States would stay, and the answer would begin with aircraft lifting off from Western Germany toward a city that had been cut away from the ground. On June 26, 1948, the American airlift began under the name Operation Vittles. 2 days later, Britain followed with its own operation, and the emergency route into Berlin started to take shape. But Washington also understood how dangerous the crisis was. Even while the Allies searched for a peaceful solution, the United States sent B-29 bombers to Britain, aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons. That was the atmosphere around the airlift. Humanitarian cargo flew toward Berlin, while the shadow of a larger war hung over every decision.
We were not thinking about history then. We were thinking about weather, fuel, cargo, radio calls, and whether the runway would be clear when we arrived.
The first flights were rough, improvised, and limited. Aircraft had to be loaded quickly, flown through narrow corridors, landed in a damaged city, unloaded under pressure, and sent back for more. No one yet knew if the operation could last a week, let alone months. But the first aircraft proved one thing: West Berlin had not been sealed completely. Now the crisis would move from political decision to physical endurance. The question was no longer only whether Truman would stand firm, but whether pilots, mechanics, loaders, radios, and runways could turn an impossible idea into a working supply line. The first aircraft did not look like the beginning of a miracle. They looked too few, too small, and too vulnerable for the job that had just been placed on them. On June 26, 1948, American transport planes began flying supplies into West Berlin under the name Operation Vittles. 2 days later, British aircraft joined the effort with their own operation, and the air above Germany became the only open road into the city. At the beginning, there was no perfect machine. There were crews, maps, radios, trucks, cargo piles, damaged runways, and an emergency plan being built while the emergency was already happening. Cargo moved from warehouses to airfields in western Germany. Sacks of flour, crates of medicine, tins of powdered milk, and bags of coal were loaded by hand, weighed, checked, and pushed toward aircraft waiting on the runway. The early workhorse was the C-47 Skytrain, a dependable aircraft with a proud wartime record. But Berlin's hunger was larger than the C-47's cargo hold. Every flight mattered, but every flight also revealed the scale of the problem. A plane could carry supplies into Berlin, unload, and return, but the city needed a river of cargo, not a trickle. The aircraft flew through narrow air corridors over Soviet-controlled territory. Below them were fields, towns, rail lines, and roads that no longer carried Allied supplies into the western sectors. The pilots could not wander freely across the sky. They had routes to follow, altitudes to hold, radio calls to make, and weather that could turn a simple flight into a dangerous approach.
You watched the instruments, listened to the radio, and kept the aircraft steady. Berlin was not far on the map, but in that cockpit, it could feel like flying through a keyhole.
At Tempelhof, the aircraft descended over rooftops and broken streets. People could look up from courtyards, windows, and rubble-lined roads and see the supply line coming down almost directly above them. Landing was only the beginning. Once the wheels touched the runway, crews had to move fast, because an aircraft sitting still was an aircraft not feeding the city. Doors opened. Men climbed inside. Cargo came out in sacks, boxes, and rough stacks, while trucks waited nearby to pull the supplies away from the aircraft and into Berlin. Then the aircraft had to leave. It returned west for another load, while another plane came in behind it, and another waited somewhere in the corridor, closing the distance minute by minute. This was the first lesson of the airlift. The aircraft were important, but rhythm was everything. If the rhythm failed, cargo backed up, runways clogged, and Berlin waited. Weather made that rhythm fragile. Fog could swallow the runway lights. Rain could blur the cockpit windows. Low clouds could turn the final approach into a narrow tunnel of instruments and trust. For the civilians below, the weather was not just an aviation problem. Bad visibility meant fewer aircraft, fewer deliveries, and another evening wondering how long the city could hold on.
When the clouds are low, I listen harder. If I hear engines, I know we have not been forgotten.
That sound became part of daily life. Engines overhead meant flour, coal, medicine, mail, and the possibility that the West was still willing to fight for Berlin without turning the city into a battlefield. The early flights proved the route was possible, but they also proved that possibility was not enough. To keep Berlin alive, the airlift had to grow larger, faster, and more disciplined. The larger C-54 Skymaster began to matter more and more. It could carry far more cargo than the smaller C-47, and that difference changed the mathematics of survival. Airfields became loading factories. Trucks arrived, forklifts moved, mechanics worked through exhaustion, and aircraft were treated less like individual machines and more like links in a moving chain. The Soviets watched the effort, and at first, the airlift still looked breakable. It depended on weather, fuel, aircraft maintenance, pilot endurance, runway space, and the fragile confidence of a city under pressure. A crash, a bottleneck. A week of bad weather or a failure of political will could still shatter the whole idea. The blockade did not need to defeat every aircraft. It only needed the system to become impossible. But every day the system survived, it became harder to dismiss. The airlift was still rough, still inefficient, still far from enough. But it had crossed the first line between theory and reality. In Berlin, people began to look at the sky differently. The aircraft were not simply military machines anymore. They were bread, coal, medicine, and proof that the city had not been abandoned. Now came the harder task. The Allies had shown that planes could reach Berlin. Next, they would have to turn scattered flights into a machine precise enough to beat a blockade by the clock. The Berlin Airlift did not survive because pilots were brave alone. It survived because someone looked at the chaos and decided that every wasted minute was an enemy. By the late summer of 1948, the airlift had proved that aircraft could reach Berlin. But reaching Berlin was not the same as feeding Berlin, and the early system was still too fragile to beat the blockade. Planes landed with coal, flour, medicine, and milk. Men unloaded them as fast as they could. Then the same aircraft turned west, while another came down through the corridor behind it. But if one aircraft delayed, the delay spread. If a runway clogged, the aircraft behind it had nowhere to go. If crews waited too long on the ground, the whole rhythm of the city's survival began to slow. The man brought in to impose order was William H. Tunner. He had experience with long-distance air supply during the Second World War, and he understood that an airlift could not run on improvisation forever. Tunner did not treat the airlift like a collection of heroic flights. He treated it like an industrial system in the sky, where aircraft, pilots, fuel, runways, mechanics, loaders, and radio operators all had to move as one machine. In command rooms, maps of the air corridors covered the walls. Officers tracked aircraft movements, weather reports, runway conditions, cargo loads, and the flow of planes moving toward Berlin and back again. The goal was simple to say and brutal to execute. Keep the aircraft moving. A plane on the ground was not just resting. It was a missing link in the chain. Routes became more disciplined. Altitudes were controlled. Radio procedures were tightened. The air corridors were organized so that loaded aircraft and returning aircraft moved through the sky with less confusion and less wasted motion. Picture a cold morning over Germany. Gray clouds, wet runways, propellers turning, and a line of C-54s waiting like freight cars with wings. Each aircraft had a slot, and each slot mattered. The C-54 Skymaster became the backbone of the American effort. Compared with the smaller C-47, it could carry far more cargo, and that made every landing more valuable. But larger aircraft only helped if they could be loaded, flown, landed, unloaded, refueled, inspected, and sent back again without delay. The true cargo was not only coal or flour. At the western bases, trucks brought cargo to the aircraft. Loaders packed the holds. Mechanics checked engines and tires. Fuel crews worked fast because every aircraft had to rejoin the stream. Pilots were briefed, fed, and pushed back toward their aircraft. Even small comforts were moved closer to the planes, so crews did not lose precious minutes walking to buildings and waiting inside.
You learned not to think of it as one flight. You thought of it as one turn in a wheel that never stopped moving.
That wheel had to turn day and night. The blockade did not sleep, and neither could the system built to defeat it. In Berlin, air traffic controllers watched the sky with a different kind of pressure. A single aircraft on final approach was not alone. Behind it came the next one, and behind that, another. The operation became a matter of spacing, altitude, timing, and trust. Aircraft had to arrive in sequence, land, clear the runway, and make room before the next machine came down. Bad weather made the machine vulnerable. Fog could hide the runway, rain could blur the windscreen, and low cloud could force pilots to trust instruments more than instinct. Tunner's answer was not to accept confusion as normal. He pushed for standard procedures, instrument flying, disciplined traffic flow, and a system where crews knew exactly what was expected before they reached Berlin. Slowly, the airlift changed shape. What had begun as an emergency became a schedule. What had looked like scattered flights became a conveyor belt. over Germany. Aircraft were landing in Berlin at a pace that would once have sounded impossible. At peak rhythm, loaded planes came in every few minutes, through weather, darkness, fatigue, and Soviet pressure. The runways became clocks. The hangars became workshops. The cargo ramps became assembly lines. Men moved coal dust, flour saps, spare parts, and fuel cans under the roar of engines. For Berliners, the machine in the sky was not abstract. It meant another bakery could open, another power station could burn coal, another family could heat a room for one more night. For the Soviets, the same machine created a different problem. The blockade had been designed to prove that West Berlin could not be held. Every successful landing argued the opposite. The airlift was no longer just reacting to the blockade. It was beginning to challenge it, ton by ton, landing by landing, hour by hour. But the machine had not yet faced its hardest test. Summer could not last forever, and the same sky that kept Berlin alive would soon fill with winter fog, ice, and cold. The next battle for Berlin would not be fought at a checkpoint. It would be fought in freezing cockpits, dark apartments, and clouds so thick that even the most disciplined machine could begin to fail. By the time winter came over Berlin, the airlift had become more than an operation. It had become the city's pulse, and every break in that pulse could be felt in cold rooms, empty shelves, and darkened windows. The blockade had always been a test of endurance, but winter changed the question. It was no longer only whether food could reach Berlin, but whether enough coal could arrive to keep the city alive. Coal was not dramatic cargo. It was black dust in sacks, heavy loads on trucks, and dirty hands on cold airfields. But without it, power plants slowed, homes went cold, and factories could not work. Inside West Berlin, families watched small stoves with care. A piece of coal was not just fuel. It was heat for a room, water that could be warmed, and a few more hours of light in a city under pressure.
Do not open the window too long. We must keep whatever warmth is left.
For many Berliners, home was already fragile before the cold arrived. War damage still marked the city, and families often lived in crowded rooms, patched buildings, and apartments that could barely hold back the weather. Outside, fog settled over roads, rooftops, rail yards, and runways. The same sky that carried the city's survival could suddenly hide the lights of Tempelhof and turn every approach into a test of instruments and nerve. For pilots, winter was not one enemy. It was fog, low cloud, ice, wet runways, tired eyes, and radio voices guiding aircraft through a narrow corridor toward a city that could not afford delays.
Some nights, you did not see Berlin until the last moments. You trusted the instruments, the tower, and the lights when they finally appeared through the gray.
Every aircraft still had to land, unload, and leave. The machine could not pause because the weather was ugly, because the runway was wet, or because the crews were tired. At Western airfields, cargo crews loaded aircraft in the cold. Coal dust stuck to gloves and coats. Engines turned in the dark, while trucks arrived with the next load before the last aircraft had even lifted off. In Berlin, people learned to listen to the sky. Engines meant that somewhere beyond the fog, men were still flying, and the city had not yet been left alone. But bad weather attacked the airlift in the place where it was most vulnerable. Rhythm. If planes could not land, cargo stayed outside the city. If cargo stayed outside the city, coal piles shrank and ration lines grew longer. That was why the airlift had to become more than brave flying. It needed radar, discipline, ground control, maintenance, traffic spacing, and enough airfields to keep the stream moving even when the pressure increased. Berlin itself became part of the solution. In the French sector, at Tegel, thousands of German civilians helped build a new runway from the damaged landscape of the city. Many of the workers were women, working in shifts with hand tools. They moved rubble, shaped ground, and helped turn destruction into another place where supply aircraft could land. Tegel was built with astonishing speed. A city under blockade was not simply waiting to be saved. It was helping build the machinery of its own survival.
If they bring the planes, we can clear the ground. We can still do something.
That spirit mattered. The airlift was often measured in tons, flights, and schedules. But morale was also cargo. And every visible effort told Berliners that the city was still fighting without guns. At night, the runways glowed under lamps and searchlights. Aircraft moved through mist like shadows with propellers, touching down, rolling forward, unloading, and vanishing back into the dark. For a child near a window, the sound overhead could mean powdered milk. For a factory worker, it could mean coal for power. For a doctor, it could mean medicine that had crossed the blockade through the clouds. The numbers mattered, because the needs never stopped. Berlin did not need one heroic day. It needed supply after supply, landing after landing, in weather that tried to slow everything down. The Soviets did not have to shoot down aircraft to test the airlift. Winter, exhaustion, fog, and arithmetic could do that work for them if the Western system failed. But the system did not fail. It bent, strained, adjusted, and kept moving. More aircraft, better procedures, stronger ground control, and new runway capacity pushed the airlift through the season. In the apartments of West Berlin, survival did not feel like victory yet. It felt like one more meal, one warmer room, one more night with engines somewhere above the clouds. That was the quiet power of the airlift in winter. It turned ordinary supplies into a message. Bread could be resistance, coal could be strategy, and a cargo plane could carry political will in its hold. Yet, the story of Berlin was not only about tonnage and cold machinery. In the middle of this vast military operation, one pilot would make a tiny promise to children at a fence, and that promise would become one of the most famous symbols of the entire airlift. The Berlin Airlift was built from engines, fuel, runways, radios, and schedules. But one of its most powerful moments began with children standing beside a fence. At Tempelhof, the aircraft came in low over the city, carrying coal, flour, milk, medicine, and the hard necessities of survival. Outside the airfield, children watched the planes as if the sky itself had become a road. They were not watching an air show. They were watching the difference between endurance and abandonment, between another cold meal and another day of hope. One of the pilots flying into Berlin was Lieutenant Gale S. Halvorsen. Like many airlift crews, he was part of a massive operation that demanded discipline, repetition, and exhaustion. But at the edge of the airfield, Halvorsen noticed something that did not fit the scale of the crisis. A group of German children stood quietly by the fence, watching the cargo aircraft come and go. They had lived through war, ruins, occupation, hunger, and now blockade. Yet they did not rush the fence or demand anything. They simply watched, polite, thin, and patient.
We know the planes bring food. We just like to see them come.
Halvorsen gave them what little he had with him. It was not enough to feed anyone, not enough to change the blockade, not enough to matter in the official tonnage reports. But to the children, a small piece of candy was not small. In a city counting coal and bread, sweetness had become a memory of normal life. Halvorsen then promised to drop more from his aircraft. To keep the candy from falling hard, he tied pieces to tiny parachutes made from handkerchiefs and scraps of cloth. The next time his aircraft approached Berlin, the cargo in the hold was still serious: food, fuel, and supplies. But from the cockpit came something no blockade planner had expected: candy, drifting down under little white parachutes. For the children below, it was a miracle small enough to hold in one hand. A piece of chocolate, a stick of gum, a sweet wrapper from the sky, and the feeling that someone had seen them. That contrast mattered. The Soviet blockade was built on pressure, scarcity, and fear. Halvorsen's little parachutes answered with attention, kindness, and a message that the people of Berlin were not just numbers on a supply chart. The gesture spread far beyond one pilot. Word traveled back to the United States, and donations of candy, handkerchiefs, and cloth began to arrive for what became known as Operation Little Vittles. In homes and schools across America, people helped prepare tiny parachutes. Children who had never seen Berlin tied knots for children they would never meet. It was not the main airlift. It did not replace coal, flour, or medicine. But morale is also a battlefield, and in Berlin, morale could decide whether people endured or gave up.
You could fly the same route again and again until everything blurred together. Then you saw the children waiting below, and suddenly the whole operation had faces.
The children began to watch for signs from the aircraft. The roar of engines no longer meant only cargo and survival. It could also mean a small parachute drifting through the air. Halvorsen became known as the Candy Bomber. To Berliners, he was also remembered by affectionate names that made a military aircraft feel strangely personal, almost like a friend arriving over the rooftops. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Only a few years earlier, aircraft over German cities had meant destruction. Now, aircraft over Berlin meant bread, coal, medicine, and sometimes chocolate. That transformation was one of the quiet victories of the airlift. The West was not only keeping a city alive, it was changing what power looked like in the eyes of people who had every reason to distrust power. Picture the scene. Ruined buildings, gray sky, children pressed near a fence, a C-54 coming in over the roofs, and small white parachutes opening beneath it, like fragments of hope. The blockade tried to isolate West Berlin from the outside world. Operation Little Vittles did the opposite. It made the outside world visible, personal, and close enough to fall into a child's hands. By now, the airlift had become more than a supply operation. It was a contest of patience, engineering, public will, and human connection. And each successful landing made the Soviet strategy harder to defend. But the blockade was not over yet. The final question remained. Could Stalin keep squeezing a city that refused to collapse, while the sky above Berlin grew busier, louder, and more determined every day? By the spring of 1949, the blockade around West Berlin was still on the map. But in the sky above the city, the answer to Stalin's pressure was growing louder every day. The airlift had begun as an emergency gamble. Now it had become a disciplined system of aircraft, airfields, radio calls, mechanics, loaders, weather reports, and exhausted crews who had learned how to move a city's survival by air. Planes came in over Berlin again and again. Their cargo holds carried coal, flour, milk, medicine, spare parts, and the quiet proof that the city had not been abandoned. The question was no longer whether one aircraft could reach Berlin. The question was whether the entire system could deliver so much cargo, so reliably, that the blockade itself would begin to look useless. In April 1949, the Allies gave their answer in the most practical way possible. Not with a speech, not with a threat, but with tonnage. During the famous Easter parade, the airlift delivered a record amount of cargo in a single day. Aircraft, ground crews, fuel teams, loaders, controllers, and mechanics worked like one vast machine. Coal moved through the system like black stone through an artery. Trucks loaded it, aircraft carried it, Berliners unloaded it, and the city burned it for heat, power, and endurance. That was the problem for Moscow. The blockade had been designed to make West Berlin impossible to hold. But every landing showed that the West was learning how to hold it better. The airlift did not remove the Soviet checkpoints. It did not open the roads by force. It did something more frustrating. It made the closed roads less decisive. Inside Berlin, people still lived with hardship. Rations still mattered, coal still mattered, and families still watched the weather because clouds could slow the aircraft that fed them.
Do not waste the coal, but listen now. The planes are still coming.
That sound changed the meaning of the crisis. Engines over Berlin no longer meant a desperate experiment. They meant routine, confidence, and a city learning to survive under pressure. For the Western Allies, Berlin had become a test of credibility. If they could not protect a city already under their authority, every promise they made in post-war Europe would sound weaker. But by the spring of 1949, the airlift had turned that danger into a statement. The United States, Britain, France, and the people of Berlin had shown that pressure could be resisted without turning the crisis into open war. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet blockade of West Berlin was lifted. The roads, railways, and canals that had been sealed were reopened, and the city that had been trapped was no longer cut off from the ground. But the Allies did not simply stop flying the next morning. They knew the blockade could return, and they wanted Berlin to have reserves strong enough to face another crisis. So the airlift continued after the blockade ended. Aircraft kept arriving, supplies kept moving, and stockpiles grew in a city that had learned the cost of dependence on a single road, railway, or canal.
When the blockade ended, nobody forgot the schedule. We still flew because the city had to be ready if the gates closed again.
That detail matters. The airlift was not only a dramatic rescue. It was a lesson in preparation, logistics, and the hard discipline of staying ready after the headline victory had passed. By the time the operation finally ended on September 30th, 1949, Allied aircraft had delivered more than 2.3 million tons of supplies to Berlin. What began as an impossible emergency had become one of the largest humanitarian air operations in history. The images remained. C-54s lined up on wet runways, coal dust on uniforms, children near fences, pilots in tired cockpits, and Berliners unloading the aircraft that kept their city alive. The victory did not belong only to presidents and generals. It belonged to air crews, mechanics, controllers, truck drivers, German workers, runway builders, families who endured the cold, and children who learned to look toward the sky. The blockade had tried to prove that geography was destiny. West Berlin was surrounded, exposed, and vulnerable. But the airlift proved that geography could be challenged by organization, technology, endurance, and political will. It was a military operation without a battlefield in the usual sense. Its weapons were cargo manifests, flight schedules, maintenance crews, weather reports, and aircraft loaded with bread, coal, and medicine. The Berlin Airlift also changed the early Cold War. It showed that the West would not automatically retreat under pressure. And it made Berlin a symbol of resistance long before the wall divided the city. In the end, Stalin's blockade did not starve West Berlin into surrender. The city held, the air corridors stayed alive, and the sound of engines became one of the first great answers to Soviet pressure. America and its allies did not break the blockade by bombing a road open. They broke it with bread, coal, engines, discipline, and the refusal to let a city disappear behind a closed gate. Sometimes, the most powerful military operation is not an attack. Sometimes it is a supply line that keeps moving until the enemy's plan runs out of time.